Welcome. This week we'll take a deeper look at a strange confluence of events in the world of cyber warfare. We'll examine the controversy over labeling foods that contain genetically modified ingredients. We'll learn about a new teaching method that flips homework and classwork, and an exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York on the centuries-old history of activism here in NYC. Occupy Wall Street is only the latest example. But first, cyber warfare. Last week, a United Nations agency warned of a new computer virus dubbed Flame that was stealing sensitive data from computers in Iran and other parts of the Middle East. Just days later, the New York Times revealed that the U.S. and Israel were behind a mysterious virus called Stuxnet. That virus attacked nuclear facilities in Iran in 2010. According to the report's author, David Sanger, it appears to be the first time the U.S. has used cyber weapons to cripple another country's infrastructure. With us to talk about these latest developments is cybersecurity analyst Jeffrey Carr. He joins us via Skype from Seattle. Thank you for doing this, Jeffrey. Hello from New York.
Hello. It's my pleasure.
What's been revealed about the U.S.'s involvement in Stuxnet? What's new here?
Everything has been revealed. It's astounding how much classified information was contained in David Sanger's report and probably in his book. I'm really floored, actually, by how much detail was revealed. But clearly, this was a U.S. covert action authorized by President Bush now, and then supported by President Obama, and done in secret. The whole point of the covert action, of course, was that no one would ever blame the U.S., and now, clearly, that's a lost cause.
Then again, who would it have been other than the U.S. and Israel going after Iran's nuclear facilities? Wouldn't people assume that it was these two countries?
Yeah, we were the most likely suspects. However, there aren't any countries that I know of that want Iran to develop nuclear weapons. That includes Russia and China. Nobody wants Iran to have these weapons, and there are at least a dozen countries that could have produced Stuxnet.
Are you disturbed that a lot of this information was released to the New York Times, or just staggered by the extent of it?
I'm actually very angry about it. I think it was a huge betrayal of the oaths that are taken by U.S. citizens who work in very high levels in the U.S. government. They have clearly broken the law, violated their oath. And all based on a phone call by a reporter. I mean, it's just incredible to me.
People who leak usually have motivations. What do you think they may have been in this case?
Honestly, I don't know. I think that the covert action that was taken for Stuxnet was a good one. Much better to sabotage a nuclear enrichment facility than to bomb it. And this was a good course of action. The bad part, of course, is that it was revealed, because it should have been blamed on bad equipment. Now it's being blamed. Now the U.S. is being the very first nation to ever send a so-called cyber weapon to another country for destructive purposes.
But why would that be such a black eye? I mean, we were the first country to drop a nuclear bomb. That's one thing. Sending a computer virus to destroy or hamper a nuclear facility in Iran that the entire world, as you were pointing out, basically does not want, and nobody dies. What's so bad?
Well, the problem, I see your point, and I agree to an extent, but the problem is that other nations in the world will use this as an excuse to send out all kinds of offensive cyber attacks. And the U.S. will have very little to say about it because we were the first ones to do it. So in our case, we felt like it was, when I say we, I mean the U.S. government, felt like it was legitimate and for a good cause. But now any country can do it for any cause and simply say, hey, it was good for the U.S., why not us?
Wouldn't that be inevitable anyway? That any country that develops whatever weapons technology it can develop generally uses it when it finds the reason to do so? Maybe whether the U.S. was fingered for having done this first, been the first country to do this to another country, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the cat was going to get out of the bag one way or the other.
Oh, true. I think we would all rather have it be you know, a different country.
Yeah. If we
We've
could
had a
say,
lot of firsts, as
if
you
we could
pointed out.
say Iran did this first, then it would maybe taint the whole thing. But what do you think about cyber warfare in general? Is it
Well,
somehow dirty? Is it somehow something? Like I said before, nobody dies presumably in a cyber attack. I guess you could blow things up by sabotaging them, but in these kinds of things where you're debilitating electronic systems, if you can actually win a war like that, maybe that's better than drones or missiles.
yeah, except that you can't win a war like that. So there will never be a pure cyber war. Cyber is a component of a military action. If we're talking about warfare, it's not a standalone. We launch a piece of code, they launch a piece of code, and it never goes beyond that. That'll never happen. So, but what we have seen is that cyber is a precursor to a kinetic attack. And in the past, this has been assassinations. We've seen several assassinations where the precursor was information on the target was gathered by breaching the target's laptop. And then from there, gathering information and setting up a sting or a spear phishing attack, which led them to a geographical point where a team of killers took them out. So, and that's a little microcosm example of the way it would work in a normal act of war. Militaries would simply have a cyber component to support their kinetic actions.
How's the U.S. doing, by the way, in cyber war defense? If your concern is that other countries will now take the cue to do this to us or to each other, how well is the U.S. prepared for this kind of thing, and what kinds of attacks on our country would you expect?
Well, I think the U.S., from an offensive point of view, I'm sure that we have as good a development of offensive cyber capabilities as any other nation. From a defensive point of view, we're not very good. When the largest internet security or software security firms in the world have their source code stolen and they don't even know about it for years until years later, that's a really bad sign. So we spend more money every year than probably anyone else on security. And we have more breaches every year. So we're really awful at defense.
Is there some kind of cyber warfare ban conversation that's taking place? Did I hear correctly, something like that?
There is. So a number of countries have tried to propagate a cyber treaty, Russia being one of them. And the ITU is, of course, in support of that as well. This just came out in the news recently because of Flame. The U.S. does not want to sign such a treaty. I am also not in favor of signing that treaty because what happens is that it limits development, but it does not stop the actual courses of action being taken by these same countries, by Russia, China, and others today in the use of cyber in their actions that are part of cyber conflicts, actions in Georgia, actions in Estonia, the massive espionage theft that's going on. A cyber treaty would have no effect on any of those things.
And we'll get to Flame in a minute, the spying virus that was unleashed on Iran. But back to the question of the New York Times story for just a second. You're upset by it. Why shouldn't we think that the public has a right to know, whether it's Pentagon Papers or anything else in this realm? If the U.S. is committing acts of war, even if it's cyber war, on another country, maybe that's something that is better done with the informed consent of the American people.
Well, this wasn't an act of war. I mean, there's really no legal definition to an act of war except that was harm caused by the action of one country that would justify an act of self-defense by the other country under the law of armed conflict. This was not that. This was a very well-tailored, well-targeted action against a piece of machinery. It wasn't really even a part of critical infrastructure. It was a nuclear fuel enrichment plant. So I think it's overblown. I also didn't appreciate the Times using the word cyber weapon just sort of arbitrarily and conflating Flame with Stuxnet, two entirely different things. And I know we're going to get to that, but those were some of the objections that I had, to the article. As far as the public's right to know, the public really doesn't have a right to know everything. I mean, that's the whole point of the necessity of conducting negotiations in secret, of classifying important national security data. There's no way that the public would have the right to know under any logical premise that I can think of.
Well, in a minute, we will take a closer look at the flame virus spying on Iran without planes or trench coats.
Mom? I'm not going to college.
What are you saying? You've got to go to college.
Well, they offered me a job, and...
Son, college is much more important.
No.
Yes.
No, Mom.
Yes.
Anyways, it's my decision.
Okay, well then decide what degree you're going to get because you will go to college.
Their tomorrow depends on your words today. The Hispanic Scholarship Fund has the information you need to help your kids go to college.
Cybersecurity analyst Jeffrey Carr is still with us, also joining us now to talk about the most recent high-profile viral attack, although it's really an act of spying, that has gotten many fingers pointing at the U.S., is the security editor of the technology news website, Ars Technica, Dan Goodin. He's with us via Skype from San Francisco. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
And why don't you start off describing the flame virus? What do you think this was intended to do, and from what we can tell, what did it do in Iran or anywhere else?
Well, so Flame is a very comprehensive piece of software, essentially, that does really what any old-fashioned gumshoe espionage spy does, which is to gather all kinds of information. It gathers emails, it gathers blueprints that may have been drawn up in computer-assisted design software. It can grab Excel files, PDF files, all of that kind of stuff. And it's like any good spy. It's incredibly stealthy. It's been sitting on computers for at least 2 years and wasn't detected by any of 41 antivirus programs. It's such an enormous piece of software that some researchers have said it could take months or years before they can fully catalog its capabilities.
Jeffrey, this is again being assumed that the U.S. and Israel are somehow responsible for spying on Iran using all of this. I don't know what you know or want to say about that. But with respect to the impact, I know Flame has what's called modules, which gives it a certain kind of power. What was learned? How much do we know?
I agree, of course, with Dan, and we still don't know very much. It appears like this is just sort of a group of technology that's been around for a while, but it's been packaged into this modular fashion. And is in quite large size, and it has been very closely targeted to the Middle East. But the most important thing that Dan's website released today, or actually talked about today, Microsoft released yesterday, was the news of that zero-day vulnerability of using a Microsoft certificate, a fake Microsoft certificate. And that was pretty astounding. So,
could this be some kind of so-called white hat hacking, a group like Anonymous trying to show what it can do to make a point that some countries, may be acting badly and you better watch out because if you do bad things, you're vulnerable?
I don't think so. Anonymous has never shown technical capability to do something like this. I I think it probably is a Western intelligence service that's responsible. I don't know that it was the U.S., but I would say it's a safe bet that it was a Western intelligence agency.
Dan, Jeffrey was expressing unhappiness earlier with the New York Times article on this that he said kind of conflated Stuxnet, which we were talking about earlier, and Flame. And you're pretty familiar with the two. What would you say are similar about Flame, and what's important to know that's different about them?
Well, what's different about it so far is that the code appears to be completely separate. You know, I mean, there are typically sort of fingerprints. So when you look at certain types of common calls in Microsoft software, you'll see lots of similar approaches, and so it becomes pretty easy. For instance, you know, for somebody to look at one Microsoft piece of code and say this is, you know, very related. It has many of the same types of fingerprinted elements, you know, in both types of code. We don't see any of those similarities when we compare Stuxnet to Flame. Very different types of coding approaches. So there are no sort of telltale signs that researchers can say this definitively proves, or it definitively gives us a very strong indication that the two are created by the same party. And that's different, for instance, from another piece of espionage software that was discovered late last year called Dooku that had many similar fingerprints shared with Stuxnet. So what is similar? Well, both Stuxnet and Flame are incredibly complex, incredibly comprehensive pieces of software that had to go through a very rigorous quality assurance testing program. And this is extremely challenging when you're talking about software that is installed on maybe several thousand machines. I mean, when Google or Apple or Microsoft has their software installed on millions of machines, they can very quickly find out what's not working because they have so many different sources of people that can give them information about it. So imagine how challenging it is for somebody that's creating software like Stuxnet or software like Flame to find out where all of the inevitable bugs are going to be. I mean, you've got to, I mean, I don't even know how someone does that other than they have just essentially unlimited resources and they can spend as much money as it's going to take to make this happen. And given this tremendous amount of resources, people, really the only logical explanation is it was a nation state. It was somebody that had the resources of a U.S. or Israel or the U.K. or possibly United Arab Emirates or somebody that has just essentially bottomless pockets.
So, Jeffrey, the last word in our last minute. One, did that satisfy you with respect to your concerns about conflating Flame and Stuxnet? Or what else might have been dangerous there in your opinion, or unfair? And does this all mean we're at the dawn of a new era with respect to how warfare and espionage are conducted, with who knows what consequences?
Yes, well, of course we are. This is a new era. There's no question. The world has changed and it'll never go back. The world is so globally connected today that we're vulnerable 1,000 different ways than we were 20 years ago. So it's a definitely new era. My biggest objection to these two pieces of malware is that one was for espionage and nothing else, and the other was to destroy and nothing else. So let's just keep them separate. And finally, while I do believe that a Western intelligence service was responsible, there is a possibility that a Eastern European hacker crew or another hacker crew, which is very successful in terms of their pockets, and we're talking about crews that make millions of dollars a year from their efforts, could have done this. A lot of these are modules that have pre-existed. They are put together in this new package, in this new platform. But I think that there are alternatives other than just three.
So a new world is dawning in both espionage and warfare. The confluence of these two stories in the last week, Flame and Stuxnet, very, very interesting for all Americans and people around the world. Thank you both very much for coming on and talking about it.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.
Coming up after a break, should foods that contain genetically modified ingredients be labeled?
Ma, guess what? I went back to college. No, I didn't quit my job. I'm finishing my degree with a CUNY online bachelor's in business. I interact online with real City University of New York faculty on a schedule that fits my busy life. Ma, you should look who's teaching at CUNY. And it all leads to a high-quality Bachelor of Science degree in business. I can attend class anywhere, anytime. Yes, Mom, even at your house Friday night for dinner.
The CUNY Online Baccalaureate. Get back to business.
Into each life, a little rain must fall. And what rains on our cities flows into what we drink. The Arbor Day Foundation invites you to plant trees in your community, so the water that flows into our rivers and streams will be clean and safe. Visit arborday.org to find out how to plant the right trees in the right place. And support Tree City USA, where you live. Go to arborday.org.
Welcome to the Solar Generation Road Trip. If you want to know how solar energy is working for America, you have to go out and ask America. We're talking to people from coast to coast who are using solar power every day. From a few panels on a homeowner's roof to large solar plants with enough utility power for a whole town. Solar energy is working for America now, saving us money, creating new jobs, and giving our world a brighter future. Go solar! Welcome to the Solar Generation.
Do you look for certain labels when you do your grocery shopping, like organic or from cows not treated with hormones, things like that? Well, there's now a movement to mandate another kind of label, one that identifies foods that contain GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, and that includes many foods you already eat. But the food industry is pushing back. New York Times national correspondent Amy Harmon wrote an article on the controversy over GMO labeling, an article that got hundreds and hundreds of comments. By the way, and she's here with us now. Hello.
Hi.
So is it worth taking a minute to define genetically modified organism and what that scary sounding collection of words means and what foods it's already in?
Right. Well, so it's important to know that genetically modified organisms are in about 80% of processed foods, things that are, like cereals, salad dressings, anything that contains corn syrup, pretty much, because 90% of corn grown in the United States has a genetically modified organism in it, would be labeled GMO, under this category. So what it is it typically refers to the manipulation in a laboratory of the DNA of a plant. So as opposed to selective breeding, which has been done for millennia, where you take two plants and you mate them and say you want to get sweeter corn, and you mate them again and you try to select for a trait that you want.
We've all seen hybrid corn, hybrid tomatoes that we can grow in our backyard.
Yes, if you want, so any trait that you would want to select, a crunchier apple, something that most food that all food that we eat today has been bred, has been modified through this selective, sort of old-style selective breeding. So what genetic modification refers to usually taking DNA, genetic material from another species and putting it into, so in this case with corn and soybeans, which are the main genetically modified crops in the United States, they have DNA from a bacteria in them too, and so that's from something that's in a different kingdom on the tree of life.
And again, people say, "Oh, bacteria, that's bad."
It sounds,
but it's really to do something good in theory.
Yes. So with corn, it protects it. The corn produces its own pesticide, so it's an organic pesticide that's used by organic growers, but it's in the corn, and so they don't. So it's, in
other words, the bacteria combined with the corn.
Yes.
Then produces a pesticide, so they don't have to spray as much?
Exactly, that's the point, yes. And with soybeans, it makes the soybeans resistant to a particular herbicide that is a milder herbicide than the previous herbicides that were sprayed. So, there are benefits. The National Academies of Sciences have sort of weighed in and said, this actually was a net benefit environmentally, or, because we were able to use less pesticides.
And in terms of public health, do we know?
In terms of public health, I think there has been there's no indication that it has affected public health at all. They've been around for 15 years. The FDA has said they don't need to be labeled, that they're safe. The European Union has said they're safe. Various studies have shown they're safe.
But there is labeling in Europe,
Yes,
right?
there is labeling in Europe. There is labeling in Europe and in Japan, and other countries do label. And in fact, food companies in those countries have, because of the labeling issue, many of them have switched to not using genetically modified ingredients. And so that's what I think, part of what's going on here is there's a hope among some people who support labels that it would actually induce food companies who, because they fear that consumers would look at that label and say, oh, like it's like a skull and crossbones, like genetically engineered, I don't want to buy that they will actually just not, they'll say to farmers, we don't want to buy your genetically modified corn anymore, you got to switch.
So if science has not discovered any human health implications of genetically modified organisms, why is there so much public support for labeling in Europe and Japan that this has come to pass? And why is this movement gaining steam in this country now?
Well, I think, so what the people who want labeling say is that consumers just have a right to know that something has been genetically modified. The two main crops I talked about, corn and soybeans, have been around for a while, 15 years or so. There's slowly a push to do more, to have, and there are applications from the seed companies to have more genetically modified crops.
Salmon, for example.
Salmon is one.
That would be the first animal.
Kind of the first animal and it's not clear whether that will be approved or not, but that's in the works.
And what would they genetically modify salmon with?
I don't know that, I don't know the gene that they're taking from another fish, and there's something else, but it makes the salmon grow faster. But that's not clear whether that'll be.
That's the next brave new world if we get there.
I think the other reason that this kind of push is happening now is because there's the organic industry is growing. It's still quite small. It's still about only 5% of total sales, but it's growing, and there is a desire. It's sort of an obvious reason for them to want to have the other food labeled. And
so wait a minute. You mean this is not just grassroots environmentalists and public health advocates versus GMO? This is also industry versus industry?
It is definitely industry versus industry. But that said, the Monsantos of the world and the Kellogg's, and they're big companies, and the organic industry is still quite small. But there is the Organic Consumers Union, the Organic Association, Stonyfield Farms are helping to finance these efforts. There have been bills introduced in several states, the most to promote that would require labeling. There's been a petition to the FDA, which has sort of historically said we don't need to label this stuff. Got over 1 million signatures. So it's industry versus industry, but clearly there is a popular support for it. When consumers are asked, do you want this to be labeled, they say yes.
They say yes at about 90% of a rate, right?
Yes. So
even though people don't really know what it means scientifically.
Yes, I think that's true. I think there's just sort of like, sure, why wouldn't we want it to be labeled? Whether it's like on the top of their mind when in other surveys when they're asked, is there anything you'd like on the label, and they're not prompted, that doesn't come to mind. It's a much smaller percentage.
Right. I do wonder whether, given finite label space, whether we shouldn't be emphasizing things that we know harm human health. And there are so many of those things. And there are so many of those things that are not on labels.
I think
rather than something that might be hypothetically scary and maybe someday might be proven to have some kind of something.
Right. I think that the popular support from it comes from this just generalized sense that is growing that, we don't know what's in our food. Like, we'd like to know, like, industrial agriculture seems like there might be bad things about it. And, what is this pink slime in our meat? And what is this, BPA in our food packaging? And so it's almost like genetically modified GM, is like a lightning rod for a lot of these
It's the slippery slope to Monsanto and Kellogg's and them completely taking over our lives.
Right.
With whatever engineering of any kind is going to make them more money.
Right, and that is the other concern that gets raised a lot is, that this is, that our food is in control of a few patent holders, and do we really want, all of the, is it safe for our food supply to be in Monsanto's control, and Monsanto doesn't have our best interests at heart, and nobody's going to argue that Monsanto wants to make money. That's what they're in business for. But I guess it ends up as an attack on a technology that many scientists think could be useful for feeding the world, and
for feeding the world, because it could also not just protect crops from pesticides and stuff and bugs to make them cheaper, but also increase productivity in a way that actually could feed parts of Africa and Latin America and Asia.
That's the hope. Now, I mean, that hasn't happened. I mean, no, it hasn't. GM food hasn't really increased yields yet. But that is that's the idea behind. I mean, that it ultimately would. There's a new kind of soybean in the works that would reduce the need for nitrogen fertilizer, which is a water pollutant and runs off and is harmful to the environment. So causes global warming. So there is that idea that the technology itself could be useful. So maybe we don't want to attack the technology so much as, look at each individual genetic modification and see whether it is safe or not.
And our viewers in Bronx and the Bronx and Brooklyn may not know it, but there is a tremendous amount of that nitrogen-based fertilizer used on all kinds of farms in the United States that gets into water supplies around the country. Is there going to be a referendum on the ballot in California this fall for labeling?
That is almost certain to happen. The supporters of this initiative got 1 million signatures, so that was a lot more than they had to get on the ballot. They haven't all been certified yet, but assuming that they are, there will be a vote in California in November on whether there should be labeling. And so that's going to be kind of a big showdown, and there will be much millions
and California is the most populous state in the country, so arguably, if they then had to label for California, they would either label for the nation as a whole, and so California would be the tip of the spear in that respect, or they would decide what they decided in Europe, these companies, and just say, oh well, not worth it because we're going to turn away too many customers, and that's the end of that.
Right. Before that happens, there's going to be a big battle for public opinion in California over GM labeling.
And so the last thing, when your article came out on this, you were surprised to see hundreds and hundreds of comments. Were they of a piece? Were they organized by somebody?
Oh, I don't know if they were organized. There were certainly a lot of comments that raised fears about GMOs, and I got more on Twitter. There were a lot on the website, and then people talked to me on Twitter. So there is this fear out there, and I've been trying to get answers to a lot of these questions from scientists and others out there who have studied it.
Any prediction how this will play out?
I don't know. There was a labeling ballot initiative in Oregon a decade ago where similar issues were fought over, and one of the things that it turned on was the idea that this could raise the cost of food. So ultimately, people might care more about paying a few cents or dollars more for their food than having
labeling or banning
could
raise the cost of food.
It could. Some say it could, some say it won't. I don't want to.
All right. A lot of discussion on this yet to come in this country, obviously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What if instead of lecturing, teachers could spend class time working closely with students? And what if instead of doing homework in isolation, students could collaborate with their peers to build understanding in class? That's the premise of a new philosophy of education called the flipped classroom. It's fundamentally a simple idea, and the name pretty much captures it. Students watch lectures at home, excuse me, and spend class time working together with each other and with their teachers. Take a look.
I'm Aaron Sams, and I teach science here at Woodland Park High School. My ultimate goal, I guess, as a teacher is to help students become learners who can learn for themselves and by themselves. One of the problems that I was guilty of even prior to flipping my classroom around was the classroom was centered around me. I told them exactly what to learn, how to learn it, what assignments to do to learn it, and when to learn it and how to prove to me that they learned it. I don't do that anymore. We changed the place in which content is delivered. Instead of standing in front of a class and delivering, here's how you do this type of problem, here's how this works, I deliver that direct instruction now asynchronously at home through these videos that we make with Camtasia Studio.
Times till whole.
Oh, we didn't do that last time.
The last step, they were already whole numbers. We had 1, 1, and 4. Here we don't have a whole number. So here's a few little tricks when you need to multiply by whole numbers. If one of your numbers ends in 0.5, you're going to multiply by 2.
All right, something 0.5 times it by 2.
Right.
Okay, write this down, guys.
Yes, if something ends in 0.3 or 0.33 or 0.66, you multiply by 3.
And when the kids come to class, they don't show up to learn new stuff. They show up to apply the things that they learn at home and to ask me questions about the things they learned at home. So now they could have my lesson, if you will, what I would normally have stood up and lectured to them in class with some added features. They get that at home. And then what they were expected to do for homework is now what they do in my class.
That was Aaron Sams, a chemistry teacher in Woodland Park, Colorado. He was one of the pioneers of the flipped classroom idea, along with my next guest, Jon Bergmann, who joins us via Skype from Chicago to tell us more. Jon, hello from New York. Thank you for doing this.
Yes, you're welcome. It's glad to be with you.
So watching the lecture at home is pretty straightforward. People will get that without too much trouble. Then what happens in class?
Well, that's the cool thing. There's so many amazing things that can happen in class. More problem-based learning, inquiry, kids get a lot of help on things they don't understand. There's a lot of amazing things that can happen. I think the key thing, one thing that, as I've talked about flipped classroom and flipped learning, is it's really important that teachers ask this question. I think this is sort of the key question. What is the best use of my face-to-face class time? And how you answer that question is different. But I would argue, at least for me, it's not for me standing up in front of the classroom and yakking at my students. Mm-hmm. I think it's more about what, that answers, there's no right answer to that question, but there's a lot of wrong answers, I would say.
Yeah, and it's, I understand the face-to-face, but is it new in the sense of anything but the videos being what people see at home? In other words, I can remember even when I was in, when I was in high school, sometimes some of the better teachers would say, okay, read this chapter at home, and we'll discuss it in class.
In some ways, if you think about that, that's probably a version of the flipped classroom. But, at least for me as a chemistry teacher, kids needed to see me balance an equation. They need to see me physically do that. Now, it can be now done digitally, right? And I think that that's really a key thing. Plus, the beauty of the video is that they can pause and they can rewind me. My own daughter had me for 2 years in class as a flipped science teacher, and she paused one day and she said, "Dad, I love it. I can pause you." You can pause your teacher and you can rewind your teacher. So that's really powerful.
And maybe you should talk a little bit about what the videos are like, because they're not just straight up videos, right?
No, first of all, a couple things. Videos should be short. Number 2, videos should be short. Keep them one specific topic. We actually made the mistake when we first started doing this, and we did the videos way too long. So you want to keep them short, but in the videos, we've got kind of an interaction. First of all, if you watch them, Aaron and I are making them together, so there's kind of a conversation. Just as you and I are having a conversation right now, there's a dynamic between our conversation because there's 2 people. It's not just one person talking at you. It's a conversation. Number 2, there's some screen capture, so you can watch me digitally writing on a board, so to speak. It's not like a camera's focused on my chalkboard. It's you're watching my digital writing. Also, we would take videos whenever we go places. So Aaron and I had an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to speak at a conference. And so we went to the Smithsonian, and I spoke about the chemistry of diamonds while standing in front of the Hope Diamond. And then that got put in as a clip inside of our video. So there's so much you can do with video that you really probably can't do, say, even with a textbook. You can't, have somebody standing in front of the Hope Diamond and doing the Bill Nye thing, right?
Right. So how much of a problem is access to technology? It means every student has to be sufficiently wired up.
Well, we had that problem. We were in rural Colorado. 20 to 25% of our kids did not have internet at home, and we flipped our classes 7 years ago. All right? So this can be done. This is our solution. Number 1, some kids had computers but no internet at home. We gave them a flash drive. They took the videos home on the flash drive and put their flash drive in there, and they could watch them on their computer. Some kids had no computers at home at all, and so we burned our videos onto DVDs. We handed the DVDs to kids, and they put it in their DVD player and pushed play. They'd all rented a movie at Blockbuster. And for those kids who don't have them, DVD players, we were willing to go buy one for them. I mean, they're like $30 at Walmart, you know, and just check it out. So you don't have to. There are inner city schools who are flipping their classes. I spent some time with actually it was written up in the Washington Post this morning, in fact. There's a school, I spent some time with a superintendent in rural Illinois who's flipping his whole school next year. And he and I are I'm helping his school flip in a very high poverty area. And that's how he's going to do it. He's going to give the kids DVDs. And he's going to buy DVD players if he needs to. He's also going to keep his school open early and late for kids who need extra help. So he's, you know, it can be done in schools with significant poverty issues.
That's cool. Is there any research-based evidence yet on the effectiveness of flipped classrooms on educational outcomes?
Yes, there's been some, and it's growing body. If you go to my website, flipped-learning.com, you'll see some research links. I, in fact, got a master's thesis a couple of days in my email from somebody, and I got a doctoral dissertation out of the UK. There's been another doctoral dissertation done. It's kind of growing. In fact, another website I'd encourage you to look at is our new nonprofit. We've started a nonprofit for flipped learning, flippedlearning.org. And one of the goals of that is to conduct action research on the topic of flipped learning, and we've got some people who are on board with that.
Are there any downsides that you can see?
I haven't seen any. There are challenges, but I don't know if I'd see them as downsides. I mean, in the flipped classroom, I can differentiate. I was never able to differentiate. I could teach to a wide variety of users. The kids, I mean, the subtitle of our book, you know, is Reach Every Kid in Every Class Every Day, because I talked to every kid in every class every day. I wasn't able to do that in my first 19 years as a traditional teacher, but in the last 7 years as I've abandoned the lecture, I can talk to every kid in every class every day. I mean, I don't know. The downside is that more teachers need to kind of learn it and see how amazing this is. What I have noticed is that the teachers who have adopted this model, I haven't found one who said I could ever go back. How about that?
Well, let's see how fast it spreads. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Well, after the break, Occupy Wall Street is only the latest activist uprising to hit the streets of New York. We'll take a look at the city's long history of popular protest.
When you throw away money on wasted electricity, you're throwing away everything you could have bought with it. Saving energy saves you money. Learn more at energysavers.gov. Traditional light bulbs actually generate 9 times more heat than light. Switch to Energy Star light bulbs, and you'll realize just how much cash you were really burning through. Saving energy saves you money. Learn more at energysavers.gov.
Did you know that getting up and getting active for just 60 minutes a day is all it takes to help you get stronger, look better, and feel great?
Or that fresh fruits and veggies aren't just healthier and crunchier, they can taste better too?
Eating better and getting more active is easier than you think.
Yeah! Keep watching for some fun and easy ways to discover the magic of healthy living in your life.
America.
Let's get healthy together!
When you think about New York, activism may be one of the things that comes to mind. But remember our city's history. The headquarters of the women's suffrage movement was here. The union movement got a strong foothold here. Emma Goldman, Dorothy Day, Malcolm X, and the gay rights movement emerged from the Stonewall riots of 1969. A new exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York explores the history of local activism. Here with us is Sarah Henry, Deputy Director of the museum and the curator of the Activism in New York exhibit. Welcome to the show. What gave you the idea for doing this? Was it inspired by Occupy, or was it already in the pipeline?
It was actually already in the pipeline, and it turned out to be a wonderful confluence that this turned out to be the year of the activist in New York. It's actually a project we've been working on for more than 3 years with funding from the Puffin Foundation, after whom the gallery is named, the Puffin Foundation Gallery. And the mandate of the gallery is to explore the history of activism in New York. So it turned out just to be fortuitous, the timing.
So what's the very first incident or movement that you explore? How far back?
We start in New Amsterdam, and there we're looking at the fight for religious toleration and religious freedom. And the focal point of that vignette is the Flushing Romanse, which was a document that was sent to Director General Stuyvesant by a group of non-Quaker settlers in the little town of Flushing, speaking out on behalf of Quakers who had been banished from the colony and protesting that they should have the right to welcome them into their homes and allow them to practice their religion. So the questions of diversity and religious toleration start right back in the Dutch era. Also the Jews, the Lutherans, there are all sorts of non-Dutch Reformed people who are struggling for their own right to religious practice.
And there's still a place in Flushing where people can go that commemorates the
Remonstrance. Well, the Bown House, which was the home of John Bown, who plays an important part of the story because the Flushing Remonstrance was 1657. 5 years later, Bown, who's a Quaker, gets expelled from the colony. He goes right to the Dutch West India Company, and he actually manages to get the policy modified, and the Quakers can stay in New Amsterdam.
We've got some photos from the exhibit to show. Let's put our first one up right now.
Yes, this is the Uprising of the 20,000. This is a story about women, young immigrant women becoming active in the labor movement in the garment industry, which was the largest industry in the largest manufacturing city in the country.
Early 20th century?
Early 20th century. This is 1909. And this was really a key turning point for the labor movements in New York and around the country, actually. For one thing, these kinds of workers have been considered not organizable by the labor movement earlier. They thought only male workers, English-speaking workers, and skilled workers who could not easily be replaced could be organized. And this event in 1909 really showed that these young immigrant women were ready to stand up for their rights and fight for their right to unionize.
And it became the International Ladies Garment Workers Union,
right.
ILGW, until they changed their name many years later.
Right, after they merged with the Amalgamated. And they were, many of them women workers, but what they were doing was making clothes for women. So,
and
ladies' garments.
I could see a line to today in that where probably people thought that domestic workers could not be organized.
Right.
And now we have a Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in New York State the last few years.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see because the union movement, when it started, was really for the elite of the workers. That was the vision of the American Federation of Labor because they felt they were the ones that had the most leverage. And the Garment Trades organization in New York City really was a turning point in terms of opening doors to industrial workers. And that would bear fruit in the Great Depression and afterwards with the Congress of Industrial Organizations as well.
Let's take a look at another photo. And this, people who know that August 28th date will recognize. This must have been promoting the March on Washington 1963 that produced the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech.
That's right. And I think it'll be a surprise to some people at what a key role New York City and New Yorkers played in that. And what you see on the left is Bayard Rustin. And he really was the organizational genius behind the March on Washington. He was a key civil rights leader, a co-worker with Martin Luther King. But his name was not really put out in the public as much, and that's in part because he was openly gay. And he wasn't considered a suitable spokesperson for the civil rights movement. It was too controversial at that time. But he had been active in civil rights since he had come to City College in New York as a young man and had gotten involved in the Fellowship of Reconciliation. A group of New Yorkers were the ones who took the first freedom ride to integrate public transportation in the South. So he was fighting against Jim Crow in the South and also for civil rights here in New York, including organizing student strike.
And this, of course, was a source of resentment in the South, that people were coming from New York as if to colonize them, or whatever word they might have wanted to use, to try to mess with what's going on in their backyard.
Well, remember that New Yorkers had a lot of freedom to organize and to become political in ways that would have gotten them into very severe trouble, and did, in fact, of course. We have famously the murders in Mississippi, including 2 New Yorkers. But here in New York, they met other people who had political commitments, who came from all over the country, and they could organize with them publicly. They could perform with them, because arts was a major part of the activist movement, and people might not like it, but they were unlikely to be lynched in New York City, and that gave them a foothold.
Now, not all of the examples that you show of activism result in uplift or empowerment. You include the draft riots of 1863.
Well, we think that it's important for people to understand that activism, grassroots political organization, is not the property of any one part of the political spectrum, and the struggles are not always on behalf of things that the modern sensibility would embrace as positive change. You know, the New York today is famously tolerant of immigrants, but not so in the early part of the 19th century. There was a major political movement, first political party in the country, nativism, organized in New York City, and on the abolition movement, the question of slavery, New York was famously both very anti-slavery and very pro-slavery. The abolitionist movement had its national headquarters here, but New Yorkers were very aligned as a city with the South, with the Democratic Party, with the slave economy.
Business interests.
And business interests, and a fear of competition from freed slaves. And that culminated in the worst day of civil unrest, worst period of civil unrest in American history, which were the draft riots in 1863, when these two forces came into
Also,
contact.
I think a lot of Irish immigrants who were like, I didn't come here to go fight a war for the emancipation of black people somewhere else in the country. I came here to work and live life.
That's right. And so there was a sort of inherent tension there. And also the role of the Democratic Party, which had organized many of those Irish immigrants who had their first political voice here in this country through the Democratic Party, was also the party of the South. So there was a built-in kind of dynamic that turned it out very explosive, actually.
And an interesting historical line, or at least 2 points, between summer of 1863 with the draft riots against the Civil War, summer of 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington photo we saw before. Let's look at another shot.
So here we are, this summer of 1970. This is the Hard Hat riot on Wall Street. And so
pro-Vietnam.
Yeah, so this was called the Hard Hat riot because it was a group of union workers who attacked a group of anti-war demonstrators and anti-Vietnam War demonstrators. One of the things that the exhibition shows is that New York has been divided, much more divided than I think we sometimes think it has been. And during the 1960s, which we associate with the progressive movements, left-wing movements, there was also a strong and increasingly organized right-wing movement that would bear fruit in what we call the Reagan Democrats and later on. But the sentiment against the anti-war movement, against what they saw as an increasingly disorderly city, against higher taxes and a growing welfare state, all of these coalesced into what became actually a grassroots movement that became the Conservative Party of New York.
And college students in the Vietnam era who were organizing protests were afraid of going out and being confronted by construction workers. Right? They were the hard hats. Now we talk about construction workers as those who might be funded by a stimulus to get us out of the recession. So the politics have certainly flipped in that regard. I think we have one more photo, do we? Let's see.
Gay Bob.
A doll.
This is from the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, and it appears in a section of the exhibition that looks at the Stonewall Uprising and its aftermath. New York was the crucible for many political movements, but maybe none more famously or more more salient for our times than the gay rights movement and those events in 1969. And what we look at is not just the events of the Stonewall Uprising, but how that generated a political movement, almost from thin air, not really, but it seemed overnight, and how that in the 1970s diversified into a whole panoply, really, of movements, organizations with different kinds of agendas. And one was really gay pride and taking command of a kind of cultural voice. And the idea that you could have a kind of Ken-style doll that you could celebrate gay culture was really a radically new thing, something you could never have envisioned just 10 years earlier.
So the Museum of the City of New York, Fifth Avenue.
And 103rd Street.
The exhibit runs through?
Well, it's an ongoing exhibition. We're going to be changing out the content. It's designed to stay alive and rotating in new stories. And so people will be able to come and see new content over time, including content submitted by our visitors and by New Yorkers, because we keep this up to date through an installation which holds projections of photographs that can be submitted by anybody at any time to show what's going on in New York now.
We just have seconds left, but why New York? Would you say New York became the urban hub of activism in America, and if so, why?
Well, the things that cultivated activism in New York are the things that make New York, New York. It's the city's diversity. People came here with political ambitions and with political activism in their backgrounds, and they discovered new causes for activism here. They rubbed against different types of people. It's the densest city in the country, and of course, it's the center of media, money, and also some of the most egregious examples of inequality and injustice that the activists then fought against.
Well, good luck with the exhibit, and thanks for the history tour.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for this week's show. We roll out a new episode Wednesday nights at 7:30, or see us anytime at CUNY.tv. Check out my daily radio show, weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC. Tomorrow morning, how European capitalism is getting in America's way. That's on 93.9 FM and AM 820 WNYC. Talk to you then.